Good afternoon or good morning. Welcome to the webinar on the subject of e-Stewards version 4. Today we're going to focus on an overview of the changes between e-Stewards version 3.1 and e-Stewards version 4. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. I have an agenda on the screen to give you an idea of the flow of today's webinar. We'll talk a little bit about PJR, who we are, what we do. We'll cover the benefits of certification to e-Stewards. We will cover transition information for existing e-Stewards clients to give them an idea of what to expect going from version 3.1 to version 4 and what that timeline looks like. We'll spend the bulk of our time covering the key changes and going through the standard itself to again focus on the changes between those two versions of the standard. We will close with an overview of the certification process for anyone who is pursuing certification for the first time. Talk a little bit about how that works, and we will close at the very end with questions. I'm going to save questions for the end. So please feel free to type them into the question field at any point during the presentation, but I will be saving those for the end. PJR, as a registrar, as a certification body, we have clients around the world. Not an all-inclusive list, but this slide certainly gives you an idea of our global presence as far as countries in which PJR has certified clients to a variety of standards. As a registrar, PJR is accredited to grant certification for, as I said, a wide variety of standards. This list it contains several examples. Obviously, today we're talking about e-Stewards. Now, PJR is accredited to version 3.1 of e-Stewards and is pursuing accreditation to version 4 to be able to issue accredited certificates with the ANAB seal once we complete that process. Benefits and drivers for e-Stewards certification may vary by client, organization. Different areas may have some different benefits associated with an e-Steward certification, but in general, the benefits and drivers include a commitment to preventing irresponsible or illegal handling of hazardous waste or e-waste streams, data security protection, social responsibility, and environmental protection or conservation. Those are really the pillars of e-Stewards. That's what the standard represents, and by maintaining that certification to e-Stewards and advertising that you have that, you are communicating that commitment as well. Another benefit would be the reduction of environmental, occupational health and safety, data security, and social accountability risks. There are various business management drivers, including improving public image of the organization, again, being able to advertise maintaining a certification such as e-Stewards, and that commitment that we talked about in the first bullet point, those can serve to improve public image. Advertising the responsible management of electronics and electronic components may provide a competitive advantage, especially over competitors who did not maintain a comparable certification. And the standard represents a framework for maintaining compliance with customer and or regulatory requirements, including the Basel Convention. e-Stewards version 4 specifically was published in February of this year. You can obtain a copy of the standard from the e-Stewards website. A copy of the guidance document is also available. Version 4 is free. They no longer charge for a copy of the e-Stewards standard. It also does not any longer require an end user agreement to obtain a copy of the standard, because the proprietary language of the ISO 14001 standard has been removed. In previous versions of e-Stewards, the ISO 14001 language was embedded within the standard. That is no longer the case with version 4, and that's one of the key changes that we'll talk about. But the end result is that the standard is now free. So for clients who are currently certified to version 3.1 and will be transitioning, the deadline to transition is August 24th of 2021. That's the overall deadline. Any certificates for version 3.1 that have not transitioned by August 24th, 2021 will be invalid after that date. The transition for version 4 requires that all audits scheduled to begin on or after January 1st of 2021 must be conducted to version 4. This is an extension from the original version of e-Stewards transition plan, which required audits to start August 25th of this year. So in response to COVID-19, this deadline has been postponed. The results of audits to version 4 will not negatively impact an organization's status to version 3.1 if conformance is still demonstrated through August 24th, 2021. What that means essentially is that you are not going to suddenly lose your e-Steward certification if you have your transition audit, but you're not fully approved for transition to version 4 just yet. Perhaps you have some nonconformities to resolve, some items to work through. If you are not approved for version 4, but you're still in conformance with version 3.1 at the time of your audit conclusion, you would still be certified to that. And once all those holes are plugged, you would be upgraded to version 4 as long as it's before that overall August 24th, 2021 deadline. This information can be found on e-Stewards transition plan, but PGR also issued their own transition plan in response to the e-Stewards transition requirements, as PGR often does when a standard is revised. This can be found on PGR's website, and it was also provided to each currently certified e-Stewards client that PGR has. So if you're still in the process of obtaining certification, you would not have gotten an email with that transition plan, but again, it can be found on PGR's website and reflects the same information as found in my webinar. And I know that because I wrote both. So our transition plan reflects a deadline, an internal deadline for PGR clients to transition by June 1st of 2021, or to have their audit by June 1st of 2021. This will allow for sufficient time for corrective action responses, our internal package review process, the decision-making activities that go on behind the scenes before that final draft of the certificate is in our client's hands. All of those things need to take place before e-Stewards deadline of August 24th, 2021. Otherwise, the certificate would be invalidated and you would not have e-Stewards certification to speak of. So keep that date in mind. Our schedulers are aware, they can work with you, but I wanted to put this information in the webinar as well for planning purposes. We still have some time, but certainly keep that in mind. It's also worth noting that transitions can occur during surveillance or recertification audits. It doesn't have to be a certain type of audit. And if you're due for an audit towards the end of this year, you would have the option to either transition later this year, such as Q4 of 2020, or have your 2021 audit earlier than usual to transition at that time to adhere to those deadlines. So another thing to keep in mind. We will be ready to conduct audits to version 4 of e-Stewards by Q4 of this year to accommodate our clients that want to transition this year. I put the same information into a timeline. Sometimes the visual representation is helpful. Our auditors have already been trained. We're working on pursuing accreditation, as I said, to version 4, and that includes updating all of our internal documentation and reporting information for our auditors to be ready to audit to the new standard. After January 1st, PJR will no longer conduct audits to version 3.1. And June 1st of 2021 is our internal deadline for transition audits to occur to prevent a lapse. That's a guarantee of no lapse. We can close out those activities within that time frame, so you don't have a lapse if you have your audit before June 1st. August 24th, 2021 is the overall deadline to transition. All existing version 3.1 certificates will become obsolete on or before that date. Further out on this timeline as well, just another date to keep an eye on. We'll talk about this later in the presentation, but July 1st of 2022 is a deadline within the e-Stewards requirements for version 4 to obtain NAID AAA data security certification. So we will be monitoring that date as well. As it gets closer, all e-Stewards organizations will be required to obtain NAID AAA data security certification in order to continue to be e-Stewards certified. So that won't be until 2022, but certainly something to keep an eye on in terms of planning, assessing how that will impact your system and getting the ball rolling in advance of that deadline. In terms of key changes in e-Stewards version 4 when compared to version 3.1, the standard is shorter and offered for free, as I mentioned, due to the removal of the ISO 14001 verbiage. Reportedly, the version 4 is easier to understand. It's overall less prescriptive while still maintaining rigor in the key areas. Version 4 incorporates the new Basel Convention trade rules and recent amendments. With the ISO 14001 language being removed, it does require a separate ISO 14001 certification. In Appendix C of the standard, you will find audit time calculations that certification bodies such as PJR are required to utilize. And I do want to take this opportunity to give everyone a heads up. If you're not already aware, you can expect increases in audit time now that those certifications have been separated. It will impact the way time is calculated. I already mentioned this final bullet point, but e-Stewards version 4 will require NAID AAA certification by July 1st of 2022 to continue to be e-Stewards certified. I heard in our e-Stewards version 4 training that we had for our auditors that e-Stewards has negotiated reduced fees for NAID for e-Stewards certified organizations since they're requiring that. Another key change in version 4 is the creation of a guidance document, housing examples and how-tos for clients to utilize. There are an increased number of definitions in version 4. We're not going to go through all of those definitions, but I did want to note, in case there's any confusion throughout this presentation, that the HEW acronym replaces the HEE acronym from version 3.1, hazardous electronic equipment versus hazardous electronic waste. And HEW also represents a subset of MOCs, which is materials of concern. You'll definitely want to familiarize yourself with the definitions in e-Stewards version 4. Version 4 includes extended producer requirements for any clients that would be relevant for. There are relaxed inventory requirements for QSCs, which would be qualified small components, pretty sure, including, as an example, the ability to put them in lots instead of having to have a unique identifier for each unit. Another key change is Version 4 allows tolling, although it does regulate that process and define that process and provide control requirements for tolling, and adds noise monitoring requirements. In some cases, in version 4, annual sampling is reduced. The outdated battery testing has been made more flexible. The on-site downstream audits that were previously required every 2 years have been decreased to every 3 years. Checks for closure plan, financial instrument, and insurance have been added. And there are now appendices on a variety of subjects, including standard implementation, rules for organizations to follow, rules for certification bodies such as PJR to follow, and data security requirements. Those represent the 4 appendices. Once a client obtains certification to NAID AAA, we would not be auditing the data security appendix any longer. That certification would satisfy the need to audit data security controls within the e-Stewards audit. So as I mentioned, there is a lot of change to the definitions, which we are not going to cover today. Certainly, I would encourage you to go get a free copy of the e-Stewards standard from the e-Stewards website and start familiarizing yourself with the definitions. This is just continuing on to highlight some changed terms, some new terms, and some removed terms. There are a lot of new terms, as I mentioned. Okay, so we will go through clause by clause. In many cases, there are not significant changes, especially to the intent of the standard, but we'll try and cover all of them at least at a high level really quickly as we go through these slides. So in 4.1, we focus on the stewardship management system, and this section includes specified items to be included within the documented scope. It also requires consideration of the precautionary principle, attempts to reduce negative electronic equipment lifecycle impacts, adherence to the waste management hierarchy wherever possible, and transparent handling of materials of concern throughout the recycling chain. So these items don't necessarily all need to be included in the documented scope, but they all need to be considered regarding the scope and the management system itself. There are no significant changes to the 5.1 leadership and commitment section, and it's shortened like a lot of the standard due to the removal of the 14,001 language. Similarly, 5.2 regarding the policy is shorter, but it does specify items to be included in the policy, the documented policy, including protection from harassment or discrimination, restrictions around materials of concern, transboundary movements and disposal, restrictions regarding prison operations. Those are just a couple examples. So you'll want to look at section 5.2 and make sure all of those criteria are accounted for within the policy as required. 5.3 has also been shortened. It requires the establishment of teams for implementing and improving the stewardship management system, Stewardship management system is a common acronym throughout the standard, including a safety team, which is to include representation from all levels of the e-Steward organization. So that's a change from previous versions of e-Stewards. 6.1 covers planning related to actions to address risks and opportunities. The organization must plan and document tasks for addressing and monitoring risks and opportunities. 6.1.1 covers risk assessment. There are no changes to the frequency of those risk assessments or the scope of the risk assessments. So those are the same. It does specify inclusions or inputs for the risk assessments, such as now including potentially hazardous processing treatments or techniques, utilized for electronic equipment processing, and other hazardous substances present. So this will vary by organization, depending on the materials you handle and the way in which you process them. If you're utilizing any PHPTs, this will impact you, and you can look at these sections in more detail, again, relevant to how they apply to your organization. It does not specify qualifications for who is able to do those risk assessments. So that will be up to the organization to determine. (6.1.2) Stewardship aspects specifies items or concepts to be considered. I have a couple examples here, not an all-inclusive list. Life cycle perspective, precautionary principle, waste management hierarchy, significant changes, things like that. The standard requires documented information as evidence of both the criteria and the results, as well as communication of the aspects as relevant. No significant changes to compliance obligations. It's just much shorter without the 14,001 requirements in it. 6.1.3.1 covers international waste trade agreements and national laws. This section is shorter. It requires MOCs, materials of concern, to be treated as hazardous waste. And e-Steward organizations must adhere to the Basel Convention's Basel ban, even if their country has not ratified it. And that is an important change between 3.1 and version 4. 6.1.3.2 is a new section covering extended producer responsibility programs. Take a look at the definition for that term if you are unfamiliar with it, to make sure you are capturing those requirements if that applies to your organization. If so, we'll be looking for documented information covering specified requirements for any organization who is participating in EPR programs to be made available upon request. EPR is extended producer responsibility. 6.1.4 covers performance verification. This is a new section, at least within the body of the standard. It's not a new requirement, but now it is found within the standard itself. It requires a documented plan to account for the unannounced performance verification program inspections that e-Stewards conducts, with specified items to be included within that documented plan, including a commitment to cooperate, having primary and backup contacts to make sure somebody is always available during an unannounced inspection, allowing them to be admitted and begin their inspection within 15 minutes of arrival, and several other criteria. And e-Stewards will be continuing their performance inspections with version 4, so that requirement is not going away. 6.1.4.1 covers reporting to the e-Stewards database. It relates to the electronic equipment reporting for all electronic equipment under the organization's control or passing through the organization's control via the e-Stewards website. And more detail can be found in Appendix A on that subject. This requires an initial report prior to certification, documenting the period between contracting with the certification body and passing the Stage 1 audit, which should represent at least 3 months, and then again annually, due by January 31st of each year, reporting on the previous year. (6.2) covers objectives and planning to achieve them. No significant changes, just shorter without 14,001. 6.3, on the other hand, is a new section, planning for changes. It relates to planning and implementing appropriate actions regarding significant changes to the stewardship management system, including considering requirements for training, communication, monitoring, and documentation. Another way you might be familiar with this concept would be management of change. essentially having a proactive process for planning changes before they occur that could have an impact on the management system. 6.4 covers contingency planning. It specifies information that's to be documented and maintained within the contingency planning evidence for the organization, including names and contact information for the third party holding the organization's financial instrument, as well as the third party or third parties with authority to access the site closure funds. So this would be in regards to planning for closure. Similarly, 6.4.1 covers planning for site closure. No significant changes here. We still need a site and inventory description, a schedule for activities related to closure, an estimation of the closure costs, any relevant requirements if third-party testing or remediation will be necessary, and that's not applicable to all organizations, that varies. All that stuff can be found in 6.4.1. 6.4.2 covers establishing financial surety to implement a site closure plan. You'll notice in version 4 that a corporate parent is no longer allowed to hold the financial instrument for the e-Steward organization. However, an exemption has been added in this section if a facility or an e-Steward organization closure costs total less than $5,000 US, a financial instrument would not be required. And if you fall into that category or believe you fall into that category, your auditor will be looking for evidence of the closure cost calculations to see that they are in fact below $5,000 US. 6.4.3 covers insurance. No significant changes here beyond the removal of the qualification specifications for the insurance professional or underwriter. We also see no significant changes in 7.1 or 7.2 regarding resources and competence, respectively. We can say the same for 7.3 awareness and 7.4.1 general under communication, so we'll go ahead and skip those. Internal communication 7.4.2 is shorter without 14,001. It does require communication without fear of reprisal of relevant stewardship management system information regarding objectives, operational controls, relevant changes, and industrial hygiene monitoring results. So that has to be part of the controls and the management system, and that echoes the requirements for the policy to include a lack of discrimination and harassment, I think was the words used. 7.4.3 covers external communication, requires communication of relevant controls, emergency response protocols, and security requirements with contractors and visitors. It also specifies the information to be confidentially communicated to upstream customers and the e-Stewards program administrator. Excuse me. There's a long list within the standard. I put a couple examples in here, but you'll need to review that section in detail. Excuse me. 7.5 covers documented information. Again, 7.5.1 is shorter without ISO 14001. This allows for organizations to combine or separate documentation requirements found throughout the standard as they see fit to meet the documented information requirements within the standard, except for the closure plan, the emergency preparedness and response plan, and the downstream disposition chart. Those are required by the standard to be standalone documents to ensure that they are always easily accessible, found promptly, all that good stuff. Creating and updating documented information 7.5.2 requires documentation of changes and revision status. 7.5.3 control of documented information requires maintenance of standard required records, so anything specified in the standard as a required record for at least 5 years unless a longer retention period is specified or required. So everything has to be kept for at least 5 years if it's required by the standard. 8.1 operational planning and control is shortened. The hierarchy of controls is still to be utilized wherever applicable. No changes to the intent of emergency preparedness and response in 8.2. This section is also shorter. It does require annual drills for relevant emergencies or relevant types of emergencies. 8.3 houses the industrial hygiene program requirements. This section addresses hazards of an airborne nature, ergonomic nature, related to noise, and of a physical nature. It also requires prevention of hazard migration. So if you have hazards in certain areas of the facility, having controls in place to prevent those hazards from migrating to other departments, common areas such as break rooms, restrooms, cafeterias, the front office. Certainly don't want that stuff going home with the employees either. 8.3.1 covers potentially hazardous processing technologies. It specifies additional inclusions to the industrial hygiene program for organizations using at least one PHPT. So I have several examples here on this slide, but again, unless you are using at least one PHPT, this would not apply to you. So familiarize yourself, with that definition. I want to say that there are tables within the standard as well to understand whether this applies to you. If it does, if you're utilizing at least one PHPT within your processes, then this requirement would kick in and be relevant for your organization. It's a pretty long list, as you can see, and there might even be more in the standard. I just try and give some examples here. Testing and monitoring protocols, noise monitoring. Let's see. It specifies when industrial hygiene needs to be tested and retested. There's a table of different types of hazards to find the frequencies. It specifies the certified industrial hygienist or equivalent, and that is a defined term within the standard as well. Some circumstances may require biological monitoring. Some may require a medical surveillance program and a written confidentiality agreement with the designated health provider. 8.4 covers planning for the management of electronic equipment. 8.4.1, It specifies topics and information to be determined and planned by the organization with adequate documented information required as evidence of both the determination piece and having implemented those requirements or those plans. 8.4.2 covers processing controls and restrictions. The requirements here are related to operational controls for the processing of electronic equipment, including materials of concern. There's a table in this section related to items restricted from mechanical processing. There are no changes in this table, the contents of the table, compared to version 3.1, unless the organization is using closed system technologies for processing, in which case those items would not be restricted. Overall, this section is less prescriptive, and we don't see significant changes to the intent of these requirements between version 3.1 and version 4. 8.4.3 covers packaging, storage, and transportation. These are requirements for controls for the electronic equipment under the organization's control, including not storing materials of concern for more than 1 year after receipt, except in some extenuating circumstances, including the addition of adequate vehicle and driver safety records to transporter and carrier criteria, stacking limits of no more than 2 gaylords or super sacks high. Those are just a couple examples that you can find in 8.4.3. Tolling operations, we already touched on this earlier, is found in 8.4.4. So this is a new section. It regulates tolling processes, including communication expectations, contract stipulations, annulment of tolling contracts if violations are identified, etc. Documented information is required as evidence here as well. (8.4.5) covers prison operations. Prison operations are not permitted unless the organization has obtained written approval from the e-Stewards program administrator and it meets specified criteria found within the standard. 8.5 covers reuse, refurbishment of electronic equipment. There are no changes to the intent here. Version 4 prohibits the sale, transfer, or donation of non-sanitized electronic equipment unless it's going to a NAID AAA certified IDP. The only other exception here would be in tolling operations or where non-sanitized electronic equipment is sent back to its original owner. Refurbishment and or repair can only be outsourced to IDPs, so it's only going down one tier is what that means if you take a look at the definition for IDP, immediate downstream processor, except for ink or toner remanufacturing, which can go one tier further. So that means for the refurbishment and or repair, you can send it directly to another processor. It can't go beyond that one processor unless it's ink and toner, in which case it can go from them to one more stop. Direct reuse electronic equipment must be found fully functional, except shipments to the IDP for refurbishment and or repair. (8.5.1) covers test electronic equipment and ensure full functionality and data sanitization. No significant changes to the intent here. Specifies testing requirements. There are some changes in this section, including the battery testing criteria, but again, it's not a significant change to the intent of the standard. Table 3 in 8.5.1 constitutes exceptions to the full functionality testing requirements. So donations or sales of unusual equipment is capped at 1% of the organization's annual total units sold and donated. Untested units sold or donated to workers is removed. So some changes there. 8.5.2 covers record identifying information for each item of electronic equipment. This section specifies the identification criteria. Sorry, thought I turned that off. One second. Okay, hopefully I took care of that now. Um, so 8.5.2 specifies identification criteria and inclusions for this requirement. It also specifies inventory requirements for qualified small components. For example, it allows the organization to put the QSCs in lots instead of labeling or identifying each individual item. 8.5.2.1 covers shipping documentation. It specifies minimum information to be recorded for all sales or transfers made accessible without the need for unpacking. So that's something to keep in mind as far as your controls for shipping documentation. Appendix A 8.7 includes the declaration or an equivalent to be used for applicable transboundary shipments. It also requires accessibility or availability of identifying information for all shipments. Other than qualified small components, such as itemized packing lists, an internet link kept active, etc. Just a couple examples there, but certainly greater flexibility in how that requirement is met. 8.5.3 covers the verification of direct reuse markets. This section is shorter, it's less prescriptive overall, and if evidence of shipments having been tested fully functional and sold for 3 times the scrap rate, at least 3 times the scrap rate, the buyer information is not required. So if you're able to maintain that evidence, then you wouldn't need to include that buyer information. That would be a change in version 4. 8.6 covers restrictions on materials recovery and final disposition. 8.6.1 specifies management criteria for materials of concern, referencing Appendix A again. It requires written proof or justification for meeting specified criteria to be provided to both the certification body and the e-Stewards program administrator before you could utilize a conditionally allowable option. 8.6.2 covers alternative uses and processes. This section specifies the approval request, the items that need to be included with it, and any other documentation requirements. It also requires written approval from the e-Stewards program administrator and appropriate downstream due diligence before utilizing an alternative process or processor. So it's not enough to submit that request. You actually have to get written approval back to be able to go ahead and do that. 8.7 covers control of transboundary movement. Whole electronic equipment is to be treated as hazardous electronic waste unless the shipment provides documented evidence proving otherwise. A written notification and competent authority consent is required prior to the transboundary movement of those MOCs when countries involved are not Basel Convention party members or covered by relevant multilateral trade agreements. This stuff gets pretty complex, so you have to take a really close look at your recycling chain, where those different tiers are located, what specific requirements those transboundary movements are subject to, and check for any multilateral trade agreements that may further complicate matters. Exemptions to 8.7 found in 8.7.1 include new parts or devices purchased under warranty, cleaned CRT cullet or glass that's been approved as feedstock, etc. Those exemptions can be found in 8.7.1. 8.7.2 covers the transboundary movement of used electronic equipment for repair or refurbishment. The labeling and declaration requirements in 8.5.2.1 apply here. It also references Appendix A again for any electronic equipment or component exports to IDPs for refurbishment and or repair. On the other hand, 8.7.3 covers the transboundary movement for direct reuse. Electronic equipment exported for direct reuse must be fully functional and not be recycled or disposed, finally disposed. So it has to have an established resale market and other criteria must be met. It also again references the labeling and declaration requirements in 8.5.2.1. 8.8 covers downstream accountability. This adds requirements to reevaluate a downstream processor upon significant change within a timely manner. This section still applies even if the electronic equipment is directly shipped from the customer to the IDP instead of first to the organization. So even if the e-Stewards organization isn't actually receiving the equipment, even if they're just facilitating the shipment of those items from the customer to the IDP, they're still responsible under e-Stewards for this downstream accountability requirement. No significant changes in 8.8.1 to the downstream disposition chart requirements, but it is worth noting version 4 specifies that the organization cannot utilize any downstream processor within their recycling chain that was e-Stewards certified and lost their e-Stewards certificate in response to a critical nonconformity until the certificate is reinstated. So if a downstream processor anywhere in the recycling chain was e-Stewards and they are not currently e-Stewards certified, you would not be able to use them until if or when they are recertified to e-Stewards. 8.8.2 covers downstream due diligence. It requires attaining supporting documentation and approval for those downstream providers and any intermediaries within the recycling chain. So those requirements span 8.821 through 8.826. So the entire section covers downstream due diligence requirements. I'm going to go through these really quickly to make sure we have enough time to finish, hopefully not going too much beyond one. 8.8.2.1 covers processing capability evaluations. It specifies that prior to shipment, that initial evaluation needs to be performed, and then subsequently those evaluations need to take place on an annual basis with specified criteria and additional verifications for any downstream processors that are not e-Stewards certified. So you have less to do if the downstream processor is e-Stewards. This relates to desk audits as well as on-site audits, and it specifies those annual requirements. An exception for those desk audits would be final disposal facilities. On-site audits are not required if the IDP is e-Stewards certified. Again, we see an exemption if they're a final disposal facility or if they're an end processor. They would have to be, in that case, licensed and permitted and located in an OECD country to meet that exemption. Again, this has been relaxed from every 2 years to every 3 years after that initial approval, but you also need to conduct this review once again if you are made aware of significant changes. The downstream accountability requirements now include review of closure plans and financial surety for the IDPs. 8.8.2.4 requires a written contract or agreement or some type of equivalent control containing specified information for all HEW and PCM IDPs. This is a lot of acronyms in e-Stewards. So for all hazardous electronic waste, and I'm drawing a blank on PCM. It'll come to me in a couple minutes. If they are not e-Stewards certified, again, we see an exemption again if they're a final disposal facility and if they're an end processor within an OECD country. Further, this section requires that each downstream processor beyond an IDP implement and meet those same requirements further down the recycling chain. No significant changes regarding HEW transportation companies in 8825, so I'll skip that one. 8826 covers records of transfer. This specifies shipping record retention requirements and an annual sampling of shipments between each IDP and the next non-e-Stewards downstream processor. Data security is located within 8.9. This references Appendix D for any organization who's not yet certified to NAID AAA. Again, we talked about the need to pursue that down the road. And again, after NAID AAA certification is obtained, Appendix D would no longer need to be audited. That NAID AAA certification would satisfy all the data security requirements within e-Stewards. No significant changes to monitoring, measurement, and analysis and evaluation, including 9.1.1, so we can go ahead and skip that, shorter with the removal of 14,001. Similarly, 9.1.2, evaluations of compliance, is shorter and less prescriptive, although it does identify an annual minimum frequency for those compliance evaluations. So if you're not already doing those on an annual basis, that will need to change within your system. No significant changes regarding facility inspections. 9.1.4 is shorter and less prescriptive regarding electronic equipment flow monitoring. This now does require corrective actions if the material balance accounting has a final discrepancy of more than 5%. So this was already a requirement in version 3.1 that the discrepancy not be more than 5%. However, now the language is stronger in that it requires corrective action specifically. No significant changes to the internal requirements of 9.2. 9.3 is mostly unchanged. There are, as always, specified inputs and requirements regarding the management review. You'll certainly want to compare version 4 to version 3.1 to make sure any changes are captured within your management review process. You need to record action results as well as maintain documented information as evidence of the management review process. No significant changes regarding improvement. We already touched on Appendix A several times throughout the presentation as it's referenced throughout the standard. It contains additional detail and criteria for various parts of the standard. So wherever it's referenced, you'll find more detail in Appendix A, such as the PHPT hazard testing requirements table. This is also where you'll find the transboundary shipment declaration example, things like that. Appendix B contains administrative criteria for e-Stewards organization. It goes into more detail about eligibility, scope, how other facilities, ancillary sites, multi-sites, subsidiaries, how all of those relate to the e-Stewards certification requirements. It covers the performance verification inspections, critical nonconformities, appropriate use of the e-Stewards logo, all that good stuff. Appendix B requires a new license agreement if the organization is purchased by another company or entity, or if there's a similar change in ownership. Certified organizations are required to notify their certification body and the e-Stewards program administrator of any significant changes affecting conformity to the standard within 15 days. Significant changes is a defined term that you can look up. Appendix C is containing administrative criteria for certification bodies such as PJR, as well as accreditation bodies that govern the certification bodies. It also specifies the audit time calculations, which I mentioned is relevant now that ISO 14001 is separate from e-Stewards and required to be held through a separate certification. Appendix D specifies the data security criteria and only applies until NAID AAA certification is obtained. For clients who are pursuing certification for the first time, I want to just briefly go over the process there. So the first step would be obtaining a copy of the standard, certainly, and then going ahead and establishing the stewardship management system, documentation requirements, everything required by the standard. There's a lot of requirements to document certain things and maintain documented information of others. So you'll go ahead and establish that system, conduct any training that's required, implement all of the requirements within the standard and within the management system that is now by that point documented. And this would include conducting your internal audit, your compliance evaluation, and conducting a management review, in which case you include the outputs of the internal audit. So the internal audit would need to come before the management review. You'll also need a contract with a certification body such as PJR to conduct your audits. Initial registrations are completed through a stage 1 and then a stage 2 audit. We'll talk about those in a moment. You would address any resulting nonconformities before a certificate could be issued. So just very briefly, the stage 1 audit is a documentation review to ensure the organization is ready for their stage 2 audit and that they have that framework in place to meet the requirements of the standard, at least on paper. Stage 2 is a full system audit, includes sampling of all of the shifts, all of the processes to get a sense of whether the requirements of the system, the management system, as well as the requirements of the standard have been effectively implemented. If so, once any nonconformities are resolved through the corrective action process, if any were identified, a certificate could be issued, which is good for 3 years. The surveillance cycle within those 3 years constitutes 2 years of surveillance audits, either semi-annual or annual based on the contract. And those represent partial system audits, not as long as a stage 2. They don't have to sample every single process, every single shift. There are some processes that get sampled every year, but the operational type processes can be sampled across those 2 surveillance years. The 3rd year within the cycle would constitute a recertification audit, which for all intents and purposes is identical to a stage 2. It's a little longer, it's the full system audit again, and would result in a new certificate, good for 3 years, starting the cycle once again. Okay, I went through this information very quickly because I wanted to leave time for questions. If you haven't already typed your questions in, please go ahead and do so while I put our contact information up on the screen. Again, my name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. I can be contacted through the main PJR number or via email. Our EHS Program Manager, Stacy DeSantis, can also be contacted via email and the main PJR number. If you are a new client looking for a quote or some information about how to proceed with an audit, sales department is a great place to start, and I've included their contact information as well. I'll leave this contact information up in case you have a more technical question that would be better to discuss offline. e-Stewards is also a great resource if you have questions about the verbiage within the standard or the intent of given verbiage, as we have to make sure we're not crossing that line into consulting. Let me see if we have any questions so far. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. Okay, All right, well, unless you're typing, I'll hang on for one more minute, but otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today. Good luck on your eStewards transition audit whenever that may occur. Thank you. I hope the webinar is helpful. We'll be offering this webinar several more times over the next couple of months as our clients get ready to transition. So feel free to reach out with any questions or tune back in to a future webinar as well. Thank you so much. No more questions, so we'll sign off for today. I hope you have a great day.